Hello there!
And welcome back to another video! This week I'm going to be doing a watercolour painting, and the topic for this video, even though I'm quite happy with the way it turned out, is my 6 problems with watercolour. And I call it 6 problems, but it can also be interpreted as like 6 challenges or 6 difficulties or things that I want to improve upon in terms of using watercolours. And I don't know, for the longest time I didn't really like traditional painting. I just liked digital painting. I just wasn't really confident with the way I could handle a brush, a paintbrush of any kind, whether it was with acrylics or with watercolours or be it what it may. But I started, after I got better at using markers, I started trying to get better at watercolour, and I feel like over the years I'm like a lot better, but there's still a lot of things that I feel like because of the medium I can't quite achieve how I want to. So I wanted to go into talking about 6 things that make watercolour difficult for me, and the first part of it is details/scale. And I find that details and scale is hard for me with watercolours because even if you get a really thin brush, the way that water sits on surfaces, it's limited in how tiny it can be. And I just always feel like if I try to draw, even this drawing, that it's fairly large. I think it's like 9 by 6, 9 by 6, something like that is the size of the paper. It's not a tiny piece of paper, but I just feel like with watercolour, if you're going to be drawing on a sheet of paper, unless it's like quite large, you need to think in terms of the scale of what you're drawing. So if I were to draw this kind of positioning of a character, so it's basically waist up, if I were to draw that on this size of a piece of paper with markers or colour pencils, I wouldn't be quite that concerned about making sure to get all of his details, like his face, fingers, stuff like that, smaller things to do with the costuming and all that kind of thing. I wouldn't be too concerned about it because I just, with the precision of a mechanical pencil or a sharpened pencil or a pen or a brush nib on a marker, you can kind of get that kind of details to it properly. But with watercolour, because it's with the brush and with water, and it can be a little bit hard to control with things that I'll get into a bit more later, like buckling and stuff like that, I just feel like I'm very limited, and in terms of like the subjects I can do, if they're too tiny, too detailed kind of thing, I can't do it with watercolour. I can only do it if I just use like a base colour worth of watercolour, then I put a lot of stuff on top of it. But to combat that, what I typically do is I just try to be aware of my scale and like what I can do in terms of size and stuff like that, and then I just try to make it as large as I can possibly make it for my medium, and try to crop it as close. And that's also like a problem I have in digital art, in terms of like I'm bad at cropping things close. So it's good that watercolor forces me to crop my like illustrations in closer, so I can get closer to the details, so the details are larger, so they're easier to pull off. But I just feel like it's a challenge. Like I'm just too tempted to do like large portraits instead of actually trying to do something with more complexity in composition, something with like again, I'll get to that part a bit later, but something with a little bit more of a background element or multiple characters, stuff like that. I struggle with it with watercolor because I can't quite get a sense of scale where I feel like I'm in control, because if I do things that are too small, I just feel like I completely lose control. And the video is pausing right now because I'm waiting for the paint to dry, which again, that's another element I'll get into later. But the second thing that I would consider a big problem with watercolor is buckling. And buckling is when your watercolor paper gets all these little waves and bumps and grooves and stuff like that, so it gets warped with the water, so it's not laying flat anymore. And the way you can prevent that is by stretching your paper so you get it completely wet, and then you like staple it down to like cardboard or something. But I don't have cardboard to staple, I don't have the staples, and I'm not confident enough to do like stretching paper, and I can't, the other thing is to get thicker paper so it doesn't buckle. But I was just looking it up and I can't justify spending that much money on paper. So for me, buckling, what you were seeing me do earlier was I was pressing the back of my brush, like the not brush bit, to the paper, because even though it's hard to see in the video, there were bits that were raised because of the buckling, and I was trying to press with the back of my brush, because what the buckling also does is, because water obviously obeys gravity, because it obeys gravity, then if there's bits of the paper that are lower, then the water's going to settle there, and that's not where I wanted that colour to be. And also because watercolour has translucency, if there's more of the paint, so more of the water settled into where the water goes, it's going to end up looking darker, and that's not where I wanted it to be darker. So I was trying to like press with the back of my brush, I was trying to press down on the bits that were elevated to try to even it out, and I was also trying to shine one of my filming lights onto it to try to get it to dry faster and sit that way, but it just wasn't really working out. But then we're moving on to the third problem that I have with watercolor, and that is patience. And here you can see the red of his suit is bleeding into his neck because I was too impatient. I didn't want to wait for the skin layers to dry anymore. I wanted to keep painting right away, and typically the way that I try to kind of control that of myself is I try to be working on two things at the same time. So I'll be working on a digital piece at the same time I'm working on a watercolor piece, so by the time the watercolor piece is dry, I'll have made progress on the digital piece, and then I can work on it some more, and then go back to the digital piece every time I need to wait for a layer to dry, and that way I can keep like my inspiration going and stuff like that. But since I'm at my parents' place for the time being, I don't have my Photoshop computer where I have all my filming stuff for traditional art, so I couldn't do that. So I was either mess around on my phone or try to plan out where to put things, and then that results in things like bleeding. Then my fourth problem with watercolors is the wet edges / blending, and you can see this quite clearly in the skin right now. There's blotches of color, and then there's little like demarcation lines around where the different layers are drying, and I know that's kind of a traditional thing of like watercolor, but when I see these things in person, they're like super obvious to me, and I try to blend them out. But then the problem with that is when I try to blend them out, I like overblend it, so then you just can't see any kind of difference in tone at all, which kind of defeats the purpose. And then I kind of layer. So that the wet edges thing I feel is also kind of made worse with the whole buckling thing, because then the water settles where you didn't want it to settle, and then it gets this dark edge around it that you didn't want it to even, like, it's even worse. So you're trying to blend it, but then the patience thing comes in, and then you're adding more water and not letting it dry completely, and you're blending it some more, but that leads with more wet edges, and then it's kind of like a vicious cycle, which I was like, because I didn't have the second digital illustration to distract me at the time, it was like taking over my thinking process with this piece, especially around the face. And yeah, the wet edges together with the buckling together with my lack of patience, it just makes, and here I am trying to, like, after waiting for it to dry, trying to blend out the wet edges, but then again I just feel like it overblends it, it just looks all entirely the same, and then what's the point of trying to add different shading and stuff like that with the watercolor if it all looks all the same. And then you can also see the whole wet edges thing in that little bit in his right elbow that I just covered, but then it dries again and it's going to have the wet edges effect again, because it's how the medium works, and I haven't been able to find a way to make it work to my advantage. But then that brings us to the second to last problem I have with watercolor, and that is backgrounds. And to me, backgrounds also ties into, you can kind of see how all these things are kind of tied together, but backgrounds ties into the first problem I said, which is the lack of detail. So because I feel like a lack of detail, like the ability, I'm like limited in how much detail I feel like I can put in because of the way that the medium works and my control of brushes and stuff like that. I just feel that backgrounds kind of take a back seat because I can't really afford to put in the detail. I don't have like the real estate, I don't have the ability, and I feel like scared that if I plan a background that's too ambitious or whatever, that I'm not going to be able to fit it in with the character. And that also again ties into my lack of patience, because to affect the background, if elements of the background are directly in contact with your character, then you have to wait for your character to be entirely dry before you put paint around there, because otherwise it will start bleeding together, which with the patience, as you saw with the red, like sometimes you can fix it. Like I wasn't too worried about red bleeding into the neck because skin has a lot of red undertones anyway, but if you're working with a dark blue background and you have red and skin tones, and that there's a chance of things to get really muddy if you're not patient enough to wait for the layers to dry, which it all goes full circle. And I really do enjoy watercolour, and I'm really happy with how this painting turned out, but I just feel like compared to working with other traditional mediums, there's a lot of problems that I feel like the piece at this stage is just like, why do I do this? But then comes my grand old excuse to fixing it, and that's how I don't like end up hating myself, because I have a huge dependency towards line art when it comes to watercolor. I super like every single like edge that isn't clean, every single little bit that's like, oh, it looks too messy, or it doesn't look how I wanted, or it's not clear enough, I'm like, I'll just fix it with the line art. And this time I'm using a mixture of one of the brush pens I got while I was in Japan, and then the Polychomos Faber-Castell pencil set that I got from Jazz's Jazzy Art Box. And then after that, I use the Signo white gel pen that I got in Japan as well. And together with all these little After Effects, I'm basically masking all my problems with the watercolor and adding details and shading. I think I also used a high-tech C for some like cross-hatching kind of thing. And if it weren't for this step, I wouldn't be able to use watercolors, I don't think, because I'd just be way too disheartened because of my lack of ability to get the results that I'm envisioning because of my lack of ability with the medium. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that necessarily, because that's just kind of how you learn. And the fact that I do have the ability to use other tools to, so basically all my watercolor pieces are 100% mixed media, because if it were only watercolor, then I wouldn't be able to get the results that I want. And I talked about, when I did my acrylic painting video, I talked about how when I do watercolors, I do depend on the line art to tie things together, but because acrylics go on, well, I use acrylics on canvas boards, I don't really have the chance to put colour pencil or inking pens on top, so I kind of have to only depend on the acrylic, which is why I'm not usually as happy with acrylic paintings as I am with my watercolor paintings. But that's mainly because it's not the watercolor bit, it's the way that the watercolor bit ties into the rest of it that makes me feel better about it. So I just feel like it's a limitation that I have that I'm working towards, and I feel like maybe if I just tried to do some like watercolor lessons or some like landscapes or things that aren't necessarily my niche, that I would be able to learn better how to use it and how it works and all that kind of thing. I don't know, it's just, watercolor is a hard medium, especially if you're used to having complete and utter control like with digital art, and I am still primarily a digital artist, so that's where my brain's at. And I feel like the more that you paint, the more that you practice, the more you're going to get used to it, you're going to learn things, you're going to pick up patterns and stuff like that. So it's not like a problem that's impossible to fix or anything like that. It's just, I don't know, it's something that I need to work on, and I feel like other people might find useful to hear about. And if you have any sort of tips, tricks, advice kind of thing for any of these problems with my lack of ability to put in detail, with the wet edges drying, with the paper buckling, with my lack of patience, I mean, lack of patience more like a life skill, my inability to like plan proper kind of settings for backgrounds, my over dependency on line art, colour pencils, weight pens, all that kind of stuff. If there's anything that you guys can say in regards to that might help, I would very much appreciate it. But yeah, this is about it for this week's video. I want to thank you very much for watching. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, leave all your tips down in the description below, and I'll see you all next week.